Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Leeds International Festival of Ideas. It's great to see so many of you here, and we'd like to extend a very warm welcome, whether this is your first event or your fifth. It's really great to see you here. The question before us today is the not big topic at all of social media. Is social media ruling the world? We've got a fantastic panel to talk through this issue with you, and I'm going to get them to introduce themselves in just a minute. But first of all, a brief introduction to me. My name's Sonia Soda. I'm chief leader writer and a columnist at The Observer. That means I write The Observer's editorial column, which gives the view of the paper, as well as writing my own columns. I also make radio documentaries for Radio 4 on all kinds of social and economic issues. Social media is something that I'm really interested in. I've written a lot about. I think probably, like many of us, personally, I've got a very mixed relationship with social media. It's hard to admit this, but I probably would say I've got a bit of a low-level addiction to it. If I think about the way I use Twitter, it's often the last thing I look at night and the first thing I look at the morning when I sort of wake up and go to my phone, which I'm not sure is totally healthy. When I'm on holiday, like many of you, I find myself thinking, oh, that would look good on Facebook and Insta, rather than sometimes appreciating things in the moment. I'm sure we can all be a bit guilty of that. But when I zoom out of my personal life, again, I think I've got quite mixed feelings about social media. Thinking about the way I use it professionally, on the one hand, it's an absolutely amazing resource. I use Twitter to get a lot of my news, to read perspectives that I might not have even come across 10 years ago, to follow reporting in real time, following people who are live at the scene. So it has some really positive impacts. It's a great way of distributing your own work, of having debates with people about your own work. But I definitely see that there are downsides as well as a journalist. We're going to be getting into some of those today. The hardening of positions. I have to watch myself sometimes. I get a lot of abuse as a journalist on Twitter, and when you've got some small follower Twitter accounts sort of telling you what a nasty, evil person you are and what they'd like to do with you, it's quite hard to divorce yourself from that and the alternative perspective, and you have to work really hard to stop yourself from thinking, oh, the people who don't agree with me are actually, a little bit evil and nasty and mean. So I really have to watch that in myself. I think sometimes the way that social media interacts with our very human psychologies isn't always healthy. So mixed feelings. But I do think, whether we like it or not, it's here to stay. It has a really dominant presence in many people's lives. And one of the things that I really want to get at in this conversation with our panel today is, first of all, a conversation about the benefits and disbenefits of social media, remembering that, we can't really turn back time and put the genie back in the bottle. Interested particularly in the impacts on young people. There are a lot of concerns about that at the moment. The impacts on our public and our political discourse and the way we have conversations about big social issues and how we agree and disagree with each other. We'll be thinking about the impact on the way we consume the news, including particularly misinformation. And finally, the sort of big how question. So given that we probably would all acknowledge that social media has some good sides to it, but also some bad sides, what as a society do we do about the negative externalities that it creates? So that's just a little teaser for the conversation that I hope we're going to have. We're going to spend about 40 minutes, the four of us, in conversation. I'm going to make sure we allow about 40 minutes again for conversations from the floor. So do think of your own questions, and I will try and get to as many of you. But first of all, very importantly, I would like to get the panel to introduce themselves. So I'm going to come to each of the three of you, and I'd like you to say a bit about who you are, what you do, and where your interest in this big question about social media comes from. So Africa, I'll start with you.
Thank you. You know what, I have to start by saying that I'm So excited for this conversation and the way that it's going to unfold today because of how different we all are. So not just because I'm on the panel myself, but also because I'm going to be soaking in a lot of perspectives that I would never normally have access to. So my name is Africa, and I am a consultant, I'm a mentor, I'm a writer and a speaker. And the work that I do is that I study and heavily research the concept of self-sabotage. Which is, every time I meet someone and tell them that, they always tell me they have a degree in self-sabotage. They always say something along those lines. But this is something that I started taking a very close look at about 6 years ago when I got sober. So some of you might be familiar or not familiar with my story, but 6 years ago at 24, I got sober after a decade of having an extremely destructive relationship with drugs and alcohol, and I had relapsed about 7 times at that point in time. And I started to, instead of just shaming myself, I started to get quite curious about what was happening to me scientifically. I wanted to understand what was happening to my brain. I wanted to understand that cycle of behavior. I wanted to understand why a part of me was could only feel comfortable if there was a low level of destruction or chaos. So that's when I came across the concept of self-sabotage, and I started using the internet actually to share my findings and to share my story. It was anonymous at the time, but that's when I fell into the world of psychology, and I ended up getting specialist training in certain aspects of certain areas of psychology. Mainly tuning into Carl Jung's work, really wanting to understand the human shadow. And my work has evolved over the past 6 years. About 3 years ago is when I started to notice a shift in how people relate to each other, that it was becoming increasingly difficult just to have normal conversations, to have healthy conflict, to be able to disagree and not give it some really heavy moral meaning about the other person. So after having studied self-sabotage for a while, I realized that what I was seeing was something that I refer to as collective sabotage. So that is what I have been studying and researching for the past 2.5 years. And I ended up writing an open letter that went viral on social media, titled "Why I'm Leaving the Cult of Wokeness." And this letter has now been read by over 7 million people, and it's thanks to social media, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But a big part of my work focuses now on 2 areas, self-sabotage and self-censorship.
Thank you.
Yes.
Absolutely fascinating. Al, I'm going to come to you next.
Thanks. So my name's Al Baker. I am currently, and for about another week, the head of research at a company called Logically, which is a tech and research company dedicated to understanding and coming up with solutions to problems to do with misinformation in the online information environment. I was there for about 3 years, where I led teams of fact checkers, journalists, researchers, and various other kinds of people. It was obviously a very interesting time to be in that particular line of work. I started just 2 months before the pandemic broke out, and it soon turned out to be, we became very busy very quickly. And that's been my last 3 years. I'm very excited to share more about what I learned.
Excellent. And Chris, over to you.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Yeah, great. I was just checked just to make sure. My name is Christopher Wiley. Most people know me as the Cambridge Analytica or Facebook whistleblower, or the guy that had pink hair for that photo. It's not naturally pink. I'm not a flamingo. I've had quite a varied, I don't know what to call it, journey, if you will. I've worked in politics, I've worked in military contracting, I now work in fashion, as a passion of mine, I talk a lot about regulation and making safe spaces on the internet, and work a lot with regulators and legislators in lots of different countries to try to come up with solutions for that.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, to kick us off, I sort of started by talking a bit about my own personal relationship to social media, and I'm very interested in the way the three of you see your own relationship to social media. So I was wondering if I could get all three of you just to say a little bit about that, your own relationship, but also, if you really zoom out, what you see as a sort of the best and the worst thing about social media in terms of what it adds or takes away from society. Al, I'm going to start with you this time.
Sure. So my personal relationship with social media is quite boring. Apart from the fact that I just happened to begin studying at university at more or less exactly the time that Twitter and Facebook became popular, so I was an early adopter at both. But I've never been particularly good at either, so I don't have much of a following. I went viral once because of a video of my dog, nothing to do with me. I wasn't even in the frame. But I've been partially involved, but never terrifically successfully. And that, I think, has been a benefit, because one thing I have noticed over the last 10 years is that the less I use social media, generally the happier I was. So my personal relationship with social media has been like an early adopter, find myself not terribly successful at being any kind of personality on the internet, and then just kind of withdrew. I'm still on Twitter every now and again. I don't use Instagram or TikTok for any personal reasons. However, professionally, I have found myself, especially over the last 3 years, being exposed hugely to lots of the worst parts of online discourse, which tend to just reconfirm to myself that I've generally made the right decision in being less involved. In terms of zooming out and the big questions, I think that my real thought is that I think we're a long way away from being able to answer that question with any kind of authority, because, and this is a theme I'll probably disappointingly keep returning to through this conversation, we just don't know a huge amount yet about the effect that social media has had on either individuals or society writ large. If I had to pick one good thing, though, it would be just the brute fact of democratizing in some way the information environment in the way that social media has is not only something which is inescapable now because social media isn't going anywhere, but I think is definitely a step forward when compared to the information environment we were living in prior to social media and the internet, dominated by dominated by specific powerful media gatekeepers, big newspapers, big broadcasters, and so on. So I think that's the good thing. There are so many bad things I don't even want to...
Well, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those. So, Chris, over to you. And also, I'm particularly interested, we had an interesting conversation before coming on stage about what actually is social media. So maybe you can also share some thoughts on that with us, as well as your own personal relationship with it.
Sure. I would describe my personal relationship with social media as antagonistic. Both in both directions. So
they don't like you either.
Yeah, no. So I'm banned on Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp.
Right. Yeah.
Because they were pissed off that I don't know, revealed how they actually work. Banned me, but not neo-Nazis. So, but I don't know what that says. But and I think in terms of my own sort of experience, I think being banned off of several large social platforms, people kind of go, oh, well, whatever, it's a trashy platform, who cares? I think for me, the thing that I've really come to understand personally and learned after being banned is how much people use it. Because when you can't use it, when you are not allowed to use it, you really start to see everyone doing all these weird things. Yeah. Like if I go to a concert, I'm not filming it all because I have nowhere to show it. Yeah. Right? When my friends have a birthday party, I don't get invited by accident because they invite everybody and I'm just not there, right? Yeah. And for me, one of the things that I found interesting is just like to experience, Facebook did it, I think, as just a punishment. I think they were petty. And when you look at how authoritarian regimes in history, like the Soviet Union, when you became, a person that was inconvenient, you didn't just get arrested or removed, they deleted photos of you. They deleted traces of you. That happened to me. My parents, when they looked on their Facebook account, all of my old messages or photos that we were sharing disappeared as well. Same with my friends. And in that sense, I got a really personal experience with the power that a social platform can have when you can sort of be deleted from your own social group and also your family without any due process as well.
Yeah.
It's just whatever they want to do.
How did they tell you that you were banned?
Through a press release to The Guardian.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, no, they didn't call. It wasn't like, oh, hey, it's Mark. Just, sorry. Gotta ban you because you're annoying. So, I think to your other question about, what is social media, I think a lot of the times there's a problematic focus on what people are doing on social media, and rather than a slightly larger question about what is social media. As somebody who still works in tech, albeit for fashion, so slightly different. But I work with people who call themselves engineers and architects. And in that, there's this notion of building and construction and design that I think is really important for people to understand. If you had a building that was constructed by architects or civil engineers who had no obligation to keep you safe, who had no obligation to think about what might happen if there's a fire in this building, right? And also can get away with not completely disregarding your safety because they put a book in the lobby called Terms and Conditions, and when you opened the door into the lobby of that building, you agreed to this, 20,000 word. It's like over 20,000 words, by the way. Like if you want to read all T's and C's of Facebook, which everyone clearly does. And that you've just signed away your rights. We wouldn't allow it when you look. And so I think when we are talking about social media, really understanding that it is a product of architecture, it is a product of design. It's not just people interacting with each other. And that there's also a designer. And when we extend that to the logic of regulation, for example, architects and engineers have professional standards. There's a building code. There's safety inspections. You look at social media and more broadly sort of platforms or whatever we kind of call tech. Well, tech has existed, aerospace is tech, automobiles are tech, pharmaceuticals are tech. But all of these industries have standards, technical standards, design standards that in the digital realm we don't have. And so I think a lot of the problems that we see because of social media come down to bad design. We don't have a common understanding of what is safety on online, and there's no instructive manual to guide the development for that.
Yeah. Very interesting. I think that's a very powerful metaphor of social media as sort of buildings and construction and architecture. And I think it also underlines a really important point that there's no such thing as neutrality in this sphere, right? Just as the same thing as there's no really such thing as a neutral broadcaster, because a broadcaster is choosing and making editorial decisions about what to show you. There's no such thing as a neutral newspaper. There's no such thing as a neutral social media platform. There are conscious decisions about how to construct it and how to present information, which I think sometimes gets lost because so much of the information is produced by users as opposed to other people, but really fascinating. Africa, I'm going to come to you. Tell us a little bit about your personal relationship with social media, and then also maybe give us your headline as well on whether social media is a good or a bad thing.
Yeah, and thank you, Chris, for everything that you just put forward, actually, because I do think when we have these conversations, we do tend to focus on the behavior. The individual needs to change, you need to change, you need to have better control. And we don't speak about how crucial it is to address it on a system and architectural level. So my relationship with social media, I've been using social media as we know it today, for example, Instagram, for a decade. So since it first sort of came out.
So you're definitely an early adopter. I only started using Instagram about a year ago.
I am, and I think because of that, I've been able to see the way it has drastically changed over time, as in, introduction of the algorithm being something that's constantly refined, and it being, even language that we use as individuals to each other, the algorithm. But for me, I'm not one of those people that thinks it's either good or bad. From the beginning, I have always seen it as a tool, whether or not I probably would never have used language like social media is a tool at the time. But I think from the get-go, I've always had what I do like to think of as a healthy separation from the platform itself. But it's been very key and instrumental in, for example, the growth of my career and me getting my message out and in what I do. As I mentioned, when I decided that I was going to get sober, I didn't have any sober friends. I was 24 years old, so even just by my age, my demographic, there were certain conversations that I was not going to be having. And because of cultural shame and aspects of religious shame, just from my upbringing, I felt that I wasn't able to speak about certain things. So going online and starting an anonymous journal, an anonymous diary, was very helpful for me, and I used social media to do that, and years later it ended up leading me to the work that I do in my career. So I have been able to experience the direct benefits of social media, and at the same time I have seen just how much it has contributed in stoking the level of division that we see. And because of the types of conversations I have, I'm able to see that maybe even more than other people, and I'm sure we're going to get into all of that. So for me, I look at it in a very non-binary way. I do understand that it has benefits. I think it's been great at allowing us to connect with people that we would never normally connect with. Even this is a result of social media, in my eyes as well. And it allows us to have access to information that we wouldn't normally find ways to reach. Like Al was saying, in terms of gatekeeping, there are so many things that before you would have had to rely on very specific channels in order to get the information. But now, because of things like independent journalism that you find readily on social media, you are able to be privy to certain conversations. So I think I am able to hold multiple truths about it.
Great. I want us now to spend a little bit of time talking about the impact of social media on individuals before we go on to talk about the impact that it has on our political discourse and the way we consume news. So, Africa, I'm going to maybe come to you first, since you've studied psychology. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you see social media interacting with human psychology and what the impacts are in that sense.
I think, because if we're thinking, for example, with platforms like Facebook and Instagram, they tend to sort of have it as part of their message, as their mission, that it's all about community building and connecting with people, and it's sort of positioned in a very community-based way. But I think what these platforms also do at the same time is that they sort of exploit our desire to belong and our desire to find people that are just like us. And then that means that we find ourselves in an environment where groupthink is thriving quite a lot. And I mean, you see this now more than ever, where people find it very difficult to encounter or to even entertain without accepting ideas that don't directly reflect their own. You know, we want to stay within the group, people that think and speak and look exactly like us. So I think these platforms, although they are useful for building community, at the same time, they encourage groupthink in a lot of ways. So that's another way that I also think about it, and it's something that I see a lot, the psychology behind sort of the group.
And what about narcissism and how narcissism interacts? Because one of my little theories, I've written about this before, is that social media tends to bring out the inner narcissist in all of us, and it's not always a very healthy or attractive aspect of our personality, shall we say.
Yes. And we were having a little conversation beforehand, and this is something that I wrote about in my open letter, when I was talking about how a lot of movements have really gained momentum because of social media, whether those movements are in relation to race, in relation to climate, in relation to so many different things that are not just political. But I think because our lives have been so heavily politicized over the past 5 years, a lot of these groups and movements do tend to be rooted in politics in some way. And something that I've found with the sort of rise of the activists, but when I say the activists, let's put a trademark little sign on it as well, because there seems to be kind of like a brand around being an activist. It's sort of like a marketing, you can build a brand persona, and we were speaking about the cult of personality a little bit before. I would say that's where I see elements of narcissism the most. A very sort of, it seems to be, and these platforms really do this, you get rewarded for sort of having low-level or even high-level narcissism. And one area that I started to spot it the most a few years ago was in a lot of political groups, how it then doesn't even become about finding a solution to a problem anymore. It becomes about the activist who has this entire profile around them. They get brand deals associated with their activist work. And I think this really thrives on social media because they also have that constant feedback loop of having an audience of thousands, even hundreds and thousands, millions of people that kind of herald them as the voice, if you will. So I think if we are speaking about narcissism, I do see it on that level, but it also presents itself in different ways too.
Chris, you've written and spoken about the segregating impact of social media. What do you mean when you say that?
So, getting back to, I guess, what I was saying before about there's a designer, there's an architect, there's also a planner. Facebook talks about itself as a quote-unquote community, but what it's actually done is it's designed many gated communities. When you look at the logic of market segmentation or targeted delivery of information, there's another word for that. Segregation. When we apply the logic that this group of people should receive and talk about this thing, and this group of people should see and talk about this thing, and then you apply that into a design and an information environment, you segregate people. If Facebook was an urban planner, it would be creating, this is the black neighborhood that gets the black information, and then this is the gay neighborhood that gets the gay information, and they don't talk to one another. They don't, and they're separated. And when you look at a lot of the social problems that we're encountering now, where people don't seem to have this common understanding of what it means to, be a fellow citizen, what your life is like versus my life, and feeling that sort of common bonds of, citizenship, that's the effect of segregation. What's so insidious about segregation is when you separate people and you ghettoize them, they stop building some kind of bridge or common understanding, and it becomes really easy to hate one another. And so when I look at Facebook, I just see a digital incarnation of segregation and redlining all over the place. And
just say what redlining is to people who aren't from the US.
Redlining is a historic, well, actually it still arguably exists, where members of certain typically black or POC communities would be bunched into a neighborhood, and they would receive, they wouldn't be able to get insurance or financial products, et cetera. But when you think about what does it mean to have this community, and who is designing these communities, and what is the logic that they're using, again, I think one of the problems that we've all, I think, touched on is it's not just about people, it's about the designer. And a platform like Facebook, you're in a position of power when you're the designer. And questioning the design rather than just the behavior. It's like when I hear and talk about people, in echo chambers and all these kinds of things, and we talk about, people should, be better at getting information themselves, I go, but throughout history, when we've segregated people and we separated them, the exact same thing happens. Like, we've gone through this many, many times before. It's just we're not sort of thinking that, like, the internet is real and the information environment. We can be neighbors in a community without being neighbors physically, or vice versa.
Well, I think there's sometimes a bit of an assumption that I think is wrong, which is that it's the internet, it's online, it's not real life, so we can segregate it from what happens in our real lives. But actually, those worlds are completely blended.
Have you ever lost your phone?
Pardon?
Have you ever lost your phone?
Exactly.
And like the panic that you feel when you lose your phone.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's like, how am I going to talk to anyone? How do I get home? How do I do anything? It's like, these are like the most real aspects of your life.
Absolutely. Al, you mentioned that you started studying just as Facebook and Twitter were coming into being. And actually, Facebook kind of started being around towards the end of my university days. And I spent a lot of time praising the Lord that it didn't exist when I was 17, 18, even younger, 13, 14, at school, with all that pressure to pose in a particular way on Instagram that I see some of my friends' daughters and sons sort of coming under. And I just feel really glad to be part of the last generation that didn't grow up with social media as a really sort of integral part of our childhoods. So I guess my question for you is, there's a lot of talk about the impact of social media on young people. Bearing in mind what you said about it being too early to know the long-term impacts of this, what do you think we should be worried about when it comes to young people? And is there a danger that we're just getting ourselves into a moral panic like we were about video games and violence in the 1980s?
Sure. So I think so what research there is kind of demonstrates broadly that children who are exposed to social media in general, this is children aged 12 and up, children who are exposed to social media in general, that there is a significant but small chance that children who are exposed to social media are more likely to develop like behavior disorders or eating disorders, mental health problems, things like that. There is a slightly stronger chance that, and this shouldn't really be surprising, but there is a slightly stronger chance that children who use social media in what researchers call a problematic way are likely to develop behavior disorders and mental health problems. So that shouldn't be really surprising that children who are already engaging in one kind of problematic behavior would be more at risk of developing further. So in that sense, the only thing that we can safely say from the evidence is that social media is kind of like any number of potentially harmful activities which children and young adults could take part in, like drinking, like using drugs, like any other number of social activities. So if I had any advice, or like my take on this would be that it should be treated in broadly the same way. It should be heavily supervised. It should be done with an enormous amount of parental discretion and supervision. I think we'll know a lot more in the next 10 years, although for anyone who's currently a parent, that'll be too late.
Yeah, and what do you say? Because I remember I once read a book by Laura Bates, the author Laura Bates, about men who hate women, online extreme misogyny. One of the things that she found was that she was going around and talking to schools, and teenage boys in those schools, they would, at some point, every school she went to, there'd be 2 or 3 saying very similar things that were sort of quite indicative of incel ideology, sort of extreme. But one of the things she said was that, platforms have got all these ways of engaging young people and sometimes taking them down some quite extreme routes, whether it's ideology or their own behaviours and self-harm. But too often parents have just got no idea because they don't know how social media works themselves. So they're battling against a real information asymmetry here. Yeah,
so there's a question of exposure to things like incel ideology and radical beliefs, which I guess I could speak to, and I'm not sure what the difference there is between those, other than the fact that they have more ready access to radical information than children, say, 20, 30 years ago would have. From a parent's point of view, I feel like the issue is broadly the same in that if you're concerned about your child, you would be careful about what TV shows, what movies they watched, what books they read, who they hung out with. And it feels like the issue there is more or less the same. You would have to be careful about monitoring your child's social media use if you were concerned about them. There are tools available for parents to do that, and it's probably incumbent on them to understand something about how the social media platforms that their children use operate. TikTok is a huge example here because there are frequent moral panics about supposed dangerous challenges and so on which go on TikTok, and very few of them turn out to be based in any kind of reality. The most recent one was a supposed TikTok challenge about injecting chicken with NyQuil, which is a sleep-inducing cold drug, I think, in the US. And this was supposedly something which children were being encouraged to do via TikTok. However, it transpired that there was only a surge in traffic for those kinds of videos after the FDA had announced that this was a problem. Something which, if you want to understand the regulatory environment around social media, starting from the point that it is entirely, well, almost entirely written and orchestrated by people who haven't the foggiest idea how any of it works, that's a really good starting point to understand the current situation that we're in.
Yeah, very interesting.
Can I just add a little bit to that?
Yeah.
So again, I think even when we're talking about kids and parents, we start to again focus on what should you be doing to help your kids. And imagine we had any other industry where, imagine if pharmaceuticals were releasing drugs that weren't safe for kids, or even if you don't accept that premise, don't know if they're safe for kids or not, and not testing them, would we be having a conversation about how to talk to your doctor about what drugs your kids can get if they're being tested or not? No, we wouldn't. We would be going, why is this not being figured out by those with the ability to figure it out, which are these platforms?
Yeah.
But I think there's a slight broader problem, or at least for me, it's more of a philosophical problem with not just social media, but all kinds of recommendation algorithms and young people right now. The whole premise of a recommendation engine, which is an algorithm that presents customized information to you based on a profile, is that it plops you into a bucket that defines you, and then it shows you repetitive content around that. Now, when you're doing that over and over again on platform after platform, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and you think about a young person's development in terms of exploration as a young human, and you've got a machine whose only morality is your engagement and your attention, trying to captivate you with new interests that it is determining for you by what it is showing you. And what does that do to a young person growing up over time when their interests, their understanding of the world is mediated by algorithm after algorithm after algorithm after algorithm? And what happens to the aspect of randomness in a person's life, or discovery and exploration in their own journey to become who they are as a person?
Yeah.
And that attacks a fundamental question about what does an algorithm do to human agency that I think is just not being addressed right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I
Yes, absolutely.
back up on that? Because I think, yes, absolutely right. And I think this, together with your architecture analogy, which I think is super instructive, points to what I think is a fundamental problem with the way we understand social media right now, which is just how new it still is. If you think about this in terms of other historical technologies which had a similar impact, I think the car is the most recent one.
Yes.
It took, 60 years from the invention of the car for the first motorway to be built, and after that, another 10 or 20 years before there was any kind of significant regulation. And that was with a technology where we broadly understood what it was for, whereas social media within 10 years became the dominant way that everybody communicated with everybody else, no matter what you were communicating about, no matter who you were communicating with. And I think one of the reasons we've got ourselves into this problem is that partly because of Silicon Valley culture and the fact that it was this stuff was all built by people who were designing and optimizing for this one specific thing. We've never stopped to seriously think about whether, so for instance, the kid who's using YouTube to discover new things to be interested in, whether the kinds of things that the recommendation algorithm was using to point the direction to the next video mapped on in any way to the kinds of things which make for like rewarding adolescent discovery of a new kind of music or whatever. We just kind of assume that attention is a good thing, or that the kind of attention that these algorithms can map is a good thing. But it's never been taken as axiomatic in design.
Well, what Laura Bates found in her investigations of this was, you might, as a teenage boy, Google feminism. The first video you go to might be Emma Watson talking at the UN, and then within 3 videos, the next, what they've shown you are extreme online incel ideology. So I think there's definitely the case that there are journeys online that these algorithms take you on to hardening and more extreme positions with some pretty impressionable young people.
But it's also because these algorithms aren't designed to, if you Google feminism and you they're not designed to show you the most informative content. No. They're designed to show you the most engaging content or whatever it is. I mean, a huge part of the problem is, I'm sure Chris knows more about it than the average person, but there's basically no information outside of these social media companies as to how these algorithms operate.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I think what you pointed to in terms of history, especially the history of the car, is super informative, because when you look at interviews of auto engineers from the 1950s and 60s, a lot of these engineers knew that, for example, bumper designs in old cars, those really cool old 1950s cars. Well, the engineers knew that the bumpers on those were lethal, that if you ran into a pedestrian, that you'd probably kill them. But they sell well and they look really cool. And engineers at the time would say, well, but you're not supposed to run over pedestrians. So this is a driver education problem. It's the same with tobacco companies. It's an education problem. Companies, when you have industries that realize that they're either exploitative or dangerous or whatever, they all, throughout history, have the same line, which is, we need more education, and it's up to you, the consumer, to make yourself safe from the product that I'm making money off of. And it's usually a disaster that happens that then leads and spurs on regulation, whether it's in aerospace or pharmaceuticals or auto. There's lots of examples where it takes a disaster for people to say, you know what, you should get your act together. The problem is that the auto industry or the aerospace industry wasn't also the media ecosystem and wasn't able to construct things that actually can manipulate that conversation itself.
And there also
it's
isn't
very meta.
There also isn't
literally, like it's meta.
Yes.
and there also wasn't such a, because what we're dealing with is information and expression. There isn't, in the case of cars or the oil and gas industry or whoever else, there isn't such a plausible case that any attempt to regulate anything that these companies are doing infringes on personal freedoms of people involved.
Algorithms infringe on your free speech all the time because it's deciding whether you go viral or not.
Well, no, precisely.
The argument of free speech is sort of premised on this idea that, are you entitled to artificial amplification? That is not a constitutional right in the United States, or in most, at least any Western nation that I know of. You have the right to say something. You have the right to a conscience. Your conscience, and you have the right to believe things. That doesn't mean that you have a right to a megaphone.
No, that's right. And
so when we're talking about all of this free speach stuff, it's like, but you let's be clear about what actual rights we're talking about. You can believe whatever crazy nonsense you want, and you can shout it all you want, but that doesn't mean that you're entitled for the power of an algorithm to amplify it.
And actually, that there's immense power in deciding who gets a megaphone and who gets amplified. And at the moment, those decisions are taken, they're driven by profit. By the profit of social media companies. And it reminds me of the conversation that we had, Chris, about the power to exclude. Social media companies absolutely have that power at the moment. They're private companies, regardless of how important being part of a social media network might be to participation in society. And it's the same with amplification. It's a huge, huge power choosing who gets amplified.
Well, even when you look at, for example, the news just about LinkedIn, I don't know if people were following the story, but LinkedIn did a study that found that weak social connections are more beneficial to to job and career progress than strong friendships. Having a wide, weak network rather than a strong, tight network. If you think about an experiment that's done on people's profiles that they're using to apply for jobs, and that's done without their knowledge or consent, and that there are experiments going on the thing that you're using to access the economy and employment, with literally no sort of oversight except for some kind of internal, like an engineer wants to do it. And my question when I saw that was, well, how many jobs did this affect? Right, and again, we wouldn't allow any other industry to have that kind of power over people.
I want to spend, I'm going to do about 10 more minutes in conversation. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the impact of social media on our political discourse, and then a bit of time, in the time we've got left, on the how-to question. To Africa, I'm going to come to you first. How you see social media as impacting on some of the big political debates that we have as a society and mainstream politics?
Yeah, I think it's a very big question, but a place that I will start is that something that a lot of people will say is that polarization has always existed, division has always existed. You've always had people that are going at each other because of left versus right, etc., etc. But I think if we're looking at this through the lens of social media, I think it's important to be honest about the fact that something has changed in the way that we connect and in the way that we talk to people that are politically different to us. And I was listening to Jonathan Haidt. Maybe you're familiar with his work or maybe not, but he's a social scientist, he's a researcher. He's doing a lot of research at the moment actually about social media, some very, very detailed, data-driven, scientific-driven research, which I think might be interesting if you're interested in any part of this conversation, actually. But he talks a lot about the fact that something that's quite different, and this is often what I'm thinking too, is that we've become so fearful, and I use that word very specifically, very fearful of people that lean in a different position to us politically. Because there was a time where you could have been, especially I think the older generation resonates with this more, where you could have had a friendship group of people that are conservative, people that don't really give a shit about politics, some people who are more far left, some people who are... You used to have groups where people could easily just mix. But now I think it's becoming not necessarily unheard of, but I think especially if you look at younger generations, the idea that you could be in a tight-knit friendship group with people that are conservative or with someone that just, and I'm not talking about the extremes of any kind of value system or belief system, but just voting differently to someone else. I think it's just becoming much more difficult for people to think that that's even an option for them. They need someone who votes the same as them, has the same opinions and thoughts and beliefs, etc. But I think especially when you are online, again, we can find ourselves going back to the algorithm conversation, because it is only showing you information from other people who are left-leaning. And when something does come through onto your feed or just in your realm of consciousness, we immediately discard it because it's not reflecting our own beliefs and what it is we think. So I think social media platforms, especially Twitter, which I don't personally use, I think it's just fueling that division even more, especially when it comes to politics.
I think it's also, this is from my own personal perspective, it undermines our ability to disagree with each other and to have conversations where we manage conflict well. And for me, social media sort of sits at one end of the spectrum where the design of it really encourages bad behaviour.
Absolutely.
It encourages you to see people who disagree with you in the worst light. It encourages bad faith conversations, actually, because of the way that the platform works, of what it shows you in your own feed. Even the mechanisms that you use to talk to each other, like quote tweeting, for example, encourage bad behaviour. And then I've also done a lot of work on citizens' assemblies, which are institutions that sort of will bring a cross-sectional group of the public together to discuss a big social issue like what do we do about Brexit and how do we resolve it. And that is actually all about how people who disagree with each other can have a good conversation about it based on evidence and come up with a consensual perspective that they can all share. And I think that that's sort of what we need more of in our politics. But it seems to me that social media incentivizes the exact opposite of that style of conversation, which I find quite troubling.
Can you imagine actually like sitting face to face with someone and actually behaving like everybody? I'm guilty of it too. Like,
Absolutely.
Where we do hot takes at each other the entire time. And then I'm like, look at what she just said.
Chucking the odd personal aside. Like, honestly, I've had really, quite nasty abuse from people online, and then when you see them face to face, they're as sweet as pie to you. And that's because people just wouldn't behave like that if they were having a conversation with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's common to talk about we used to be able to have conversations across the political divide and so on. But there's no point in history where people could have had conversations in the way that people do have them on social media. Like, I would never have run into Peter Oborne or some columnist in the pub previously and been able to tell him what I thought about. So it's just, I think it's one thing I think in general which is a problem, and I wish people did less of, is use the previous media epoch as a kind of standard by which
as a golden age
by which we should kind of try and return to, because one thing social media does do in an incredibly problematic in a way that it's not designed to fit this purpose, but it permits discussions which would never have been possible previously.
And access.
So how could you even have had how could I even have let Owen Jones know what I thought about his latest article before social media? Could have written a letter to the editor, but then it has to get through the editor's desk. What have you said?
Although I do think one of the things, I totally agree with you, and I guess the question is how you facilitate that access and do it in a productive way rather than an unproductive way. I think the issue now is, and I've noticed this with other journalists as well, is the way that I've used Twitter has changed a bit in the last couple of years, and I try and not get into conversations with people on Twitter now, because I think they can tend to disintegrate quite quickly and become quite bad faith. And actually, I just think, what's the point? It's much better to go to events and talk to people about their different perspectives. So I think there's a real question about how you do it well, rather than in a way that actually discourages people from doing it or encourages them to do it for the wrong reasons, like they want to have a pop at somebody.
No, absolutely. I mean, and one of my big bugbears about social media and kind of reasons why I think we have so many problems in understanding how to use it properly is that both Twitter and Facebook, I think to a lesser extent, Instagram and TikTok, are trying to be universal platforms for speech, to including everybody who wants to talk about any subject that they want to talk about. And there are some things that Twitter, there are some kinds of conversation that Twitter is very well suited to promote, but there are many, many other kinds that it isn't. So I think one of the real problems tied back again to the fact that I don't think we really have a good grip on what social media is for or what it should be used for is that Twitter is, as it's very well designed for some kind of conversations, is going to be ruinously bad at facilitating others.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before we go out to audience Q&A, I'd like, Al, you just to summarise essentially what's going in the UK around regulation, because the UK is seen as a bit of a pioneer in the approach it's trying to develop to regulating social media. So if you could do that in a minute or two for us, and then Africa and Chris, don't worry, I'm going to come back to you for your take on regulation as we do some audience Q&A. But Al, if you could do that for us before, because I think that's an important bit of the conversation we haven't had yet.
Yeah, so helpfully for the sake of brevity, a lot of the details are yet to be worked out, but the online safety bill in the UK and the Digital Services Act in the EU are essentially the first big efforts by Western democratic governments to regulate the online information space in a recognition that the way things are set up currently just doesn't work, meaning that the way that things are set up currently is leaving social media platforms to manage things more or less however they like. the provisions in there are largely to do with mandating a certain degree of transparency from social media companies, the idea being that we want to know, or regulators rather, and journalists and researchers and other kinds of other areas of civic society want to know how much of various kinds of problematic content exists on these platforms, what kinds of actions that they're taking to mitigate or reduce the risk, and we want access to the data from the platforms themselves in order to verify it externally. And none of that is all stuff that currently is just not available. So the online safety bill is it's been put off for a couple of years now, and it keeps getting kind of changed.
Probably going to be put off.
Probably put off for a little while longer. And Liz Truss was sending some signals that she was that seemed like she wants to take a bit of a wrecking ball to the whole thing. But we'll see. So yes, lots of the details still to be worked out, including specifically there's this big category called legal but harmful content, which is where things like misinformation are going to live. And that is yet to be defined, and as are the kind of measures which platforms will be required to take to mitigate it. But a lot of the illegal content, which is stuff that everyone will be familiar with, child sexual abuse imagery, terrorism-related content, and that kinds of things, that's all solidly worked out. But the bulk of the bill has to do with is an attempt to force platforms to be transparent about what's going on in their platform and the steps that they're taking to mitigate or reduce that kind of content. Personally, the thing I'm most excited about is to learn how much of what is going on the platforms themselves actually know. Because after 3 years of working with some of these platforms, one develops a suspicion that maybe we're in a situation of the blind leading the blind a lot of the time.
Excellent. Well, that's a sort of optimistic note to finish this bit of the discussion on. Great. I'm now going to look to the audience for some questions. Hopefully there'll be a few lights come up so I can see your faces. Great. I'll take them in blocks of 2 or 3, and I've got a couple I can see already. So we're going to come to the lady in the front here, and then the gentleman in the hoodie on the 4th row. And then we'll take one question. The guy at the back. I think you're a guy. Yeah, it's really hard to see. Yeah, you. Yeah, exactly you. So we'll do those 3 first. Sorry, it's a bit hard to see with the bright lights on us. So first one at the front here.
Thank you. Hi, that's...
Hi. Oh dear.
That's all been interesting. I've been reflecting on what you've said and wondering. Something I thought that you may have touched upon is that in terms of social media, we're not really the consumers of it, we're the product of it. And in terms of advertisers and the platforms themselves, their design and the goals of what they're doing is geared around how we use it and how they can profit from it. So in terms of finding a solution to make it a safer space, a less destructive force, do you think that that kind of aligns with capitalism at all? And making us perhaps less of the product of it?
Very interesting. Great question. Thank you. Gentleman over here in the hoodie.
You want me just to speak very loudly?
Yeah, if you can, just stand up and shout. It's always good.
I've come across a number of friends and acquaintances recently who have got drawn into conspiracy theories, I do the commas, which have very true claims. I mean, I love the Spotify conspiracy theories analysis podcast for looking at things. I love them. They do get to think about how we know stuff, ontology and all that. But one question I've got, and rather than condemning people and getting annoyed with them, I've tried to understand what is the driver for conspiracy theories. And one idea I've come up with is this idea of self-esteem. Sort of think some of the work you've done in Africa is to people with thinking they've got a cachet of knowledge that maybe puts them above. But these are often people who might be socially isolated and vulnerable in some way. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out to look down on that.
Thank you. And then the gentleman at the back. It's this. Yeah, we got a mic for.
So the question I had was about polarisation and whether the kind of meanness that seems to kind of go backwards and forwards between people on social media is actually down to short attention spans and time. And you said that, when you're having a conversation with someone in real life, you wouldn't just burn them and then walk away. You wouldn't insult them and then turn your back on them and walk away. If you're in a discussion with someone, you give them the time. And, I've spent a bit of time on YouTube looking at the comments over certain controversial videos, and it seems that the longer people spend talking to each other, the more likely they are to find common ground. And so a lot of people are kind of mean to each other online or say something that's a little bit, just to burn the other person, because they can just click onto another video and go away. Would it be better if you're going to comment on something or getting drawn into a dialogue with someone, that you're locked into that dialogue, so it won't let you go to another video until you have the conversation?
Oh gosh!
And then both people have to kind of click a button that says, yes, we found common ground, and then you're allowed to leave.
Wow. Oh, well, that's something we should be putting forward for the online safety bill, I think. Right, well, excellent question, or not. Thank you. Right, first of all, I'm going to come to Chris on this issue of profit. We've already had this conversation about how everything is driven by profit in this space. I've actually seen some people say, look, social media platforms are the new natural monopolies. Maybe we should just go totally the other way. Maybe we should nationalise them. We don't really have any choice about which ones we use, because there are some big dominant ones, and we've nationalised energy in the past. We've nationalised the railways. Surely this needs to be at least regulated like a monopoly, even if we don't go as far as nationalisation. Chris, what's your take on that?
Where to start? I mean, I think that, when I think about social media and the nature of capitalism, if we're going to start there, it's sort of extractive intimacy. We're creating a monetizable product out of our social bonds. And whether the sort of fabric of our culture should be a monetizable product, I think, is a valid question. And people of different political beliefs, and whether you're a hyper-capitalist or not, can speak to that. But I think calling it out for what it is, we are taking human bonds and turning it into a monetizable product. Should my friendship with you or my relationship with you have a dollar tag attached to it? Should your identity become a monetizable product? When you think about all of the data that is collected about you, and that turns into a profile. When we think about where does this extend, into the future, even now you can look at, structural problems with things like credit referencing, right? Your access to financial products in the United States can be hyper-racialized. If we create a system and a society in the future where your data self, the quantification of your identity becomes a monetizable product, and also that product is the entry point for access into society, whether or not you can enter this store or not, because a piece of AI decides whether you're a security threat or not, based on your profile, which is quote unquote objective because it's a piece of AI or it's math. And so I think that there are real fundamental questions about, capitalism and whether we should extend this logic into really intimate, human, and fundamental things. And it's a question that I don't want to necessarily provide an answer to, but I think it's a question that isn't really also being thought about.
Agreed.
Identity,
or even
agency,
asked, right?
Intimacy, are these words that we want to associate with money and a price tag and a valuation.
It's a great way of putting it. Africa, I'm going to come to you now on the question about conspiracy theories and how people end up getting drawn into these online, and what psychology says about it, and what is the link with self-esteem.
I think this is one of those things, like many things, where I really don't have a neat answer, because for me personally, it brings up more questions than an answer, simply because even if I was just to look at the past 2 years, at how so many things that were labeled a conspiracy theory 6 months ago or a year ago or 2 years ago have materialized, and everyone has kind of just pretended nothing happened, this was never a discussion. It's left me in a state of questioning where conspiracy theory is it now seems to be one of those things that is also weaponized against people that might not be in agreement with the majority. Of course, I do know what it means, and if I was to kind of come up with some kind of answer, I think a lot of the time it is because people have a distrust. So, for example, if we're talking about the government, a lot of people have strong distrust of the government, and for good reason, for the most part, right? But I think it's, again, just not easy for me to answer because who decides what a conspiracy theory is? Are we just using it as a way to sort of insult someone, to make someone stop a conversation?
Well, I think there is some...
And also, just the premise here of the conversation is that every conspiracy theory is untrue. As a whistleblower, I witnessed literal conspiracies which were true. And just to point out,
this is a problem just related to measuring. So something a lot of people have a strong sense of is that there are more harmful conspiracies about than conspiracy theories and theorists about now than there were previously. Something that's made that incredibly difficult to measure has been the fact that one of the most popular and consequential, definitely false conspiracy theories of recent times has been the QAnon mythos, the whole QAnon expanded universe. A big part of which is the core belief that powerful elites routinely engage in child trafficking for cannibalistic ends. Usually, one of the ways that has made this one of the ways that this has been made incredibly difficult to measure, particularly in the UK, is that routinely when people put surveys out to try and gauge how popular conspiracy theories are, you don't just ask someone, "Are you a conspiracist?" You ask them whether they believe that, whether they agree with certain statements. One of which has recently been, "Do you believe that the elite is routinely covering up like child trafficking and sexual abuses?" There's a problem which my colleagues and I have taken to calling the Prince Andrew effect in the UK at least, which is that it is absolutely not unreasonable currently to think that certain areas of the establishment do engage in that kind of behavior.
Right.
So what you're doing when you're asking these questions is not necessarily measuring whether people believe in QAnon, but whether they distrust government institutions more broadly. Some other evidence seems to suggest that, broadly speaking, conspiracy theorists are not that much more numerous now than they have been historically. However, what they definitely are is louder, more productive. Just as everyone is now more able to find their people online than they were previously, conspiracy theorists now also can find their people online a lot quicker. The conspiracies can evolve to kind of take account of current events much more broadly. However, just in response to the actual question, the question of why people believe in untrue conspiracy theories is super interesting. Generally, I think the answer that the gentleman suggested is definitely plausible. But getting back to Chris's excellent point of how we should generally resist problematizing issues to do with social media in terms of responsibility, I think the more interesting question, particularly if we're thinking about QAnon, is how social media made QAnon as impactful as it turned out to be, and from a just policy perspective, how it was allowed to fester for so long on the platforms before any action was taken.
Very good
and
question.
Can I just quickly add to that? Is just to touch on your point about the problematizing of the problematizing, getting meta here, is when imagine you are in a position where everything that you see around you, everything that you're clicking on, everyone that you start interacting with is talking about things that are happening. It's not unreasonable for a person to start believing those things. There's a legal construct of undue influence when you're looking at relationships of power or asymmetric information. We don't blame people when they're defrauded. Right? So we don't ask okay, you thought that this was the car that you were going to get, but you should have known that obviously this guy was scamming you, right? That person's a victim. And so when I look at people who believe in different things, some of which is just patently not true, I think of it more as a systemic victimization of people. And that systemic victimization is at the hands of designers of AI. Again, getting back to thinking about this is a system that is victimizing people and it is exploiting people. And when we start talking about, well, these people believe this or this and it's crazy and they're obviously at fault, we're ignoring the fact that there's a company or a series of companies with designers and architects that are building things that are causing this.
Great. Okay, I'm going to come for another round of questions now. If I could see hands, please. Right, I'm going to go to the lady in the black at the front, and then I've been asked to sort of pick people out so we know. I'll go to the gentleman with a cap in the last row, and then I'll go to the lady in the blue over there. Thank you. So over here first, please.
So you've talked about the effect on mental health and things about like anxiety, depression, that kind of side of mental health. So from a neurodiversity side, I've got ADHD, so one of the things I really struggle with is I'm constantly seeking out dopamine all the time. The designers of apps have made them so that it plays into that and you're constantly wanting to scroll and look further and further. I found now that it's made me struggle to go the other way. So I'm now really into TikTok and I'm Googling, like, can I make TikTok scroll without having to manually do it? And I was like, whoa, why am I Googling that? I shouldn't be doing this. And I can't sit down and watch a full YouTube video anymore without getting bored. Or I listen to an Audible book on 2x speed. I think that kind of links through to this whole, like, people like to see infographics now rather than click through to a link and read a full article.
Yes.
I speak to my friends who are neurotypical, and they're seeing the same thing. I thought it was maybe just because I had ADHD, but it seems like more and more people are getting lowered attention spans now. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
Thank you. Go to the gentleman in the cap at the back there. Great, we've got the mic on you now.
Just on the point that the algorithm, the system that exploits people, maybe shining some light on that. I mean, governments have a job at trying to control and get harmony from everybody. You saw with COVID and things, it's when everyone's acting in the same way, it's safer for everybody. How healthy do you think that social media has a role in controlling that narrative? It might be to suppress some information, to make it kind of healthier and more cohesive for others to act, even though it's not absolute truth. Should social media play a role in that?
Thank you. And then the lady in the blue top on the back row there. So, yeah, we'll wait for the mic to come round to you then. Thank you.
So I think that for the most part, we can kind of agree that what gets posted on Instagram or other social media platforms is not necessarily an accurate representation of real life. So where has this obsession with living your life quite vicariously through Instagram, especially Instagram, be it on your own profile or even through somebody else's, through an Instagram for an Instagram influencer that you follow, where has that obsession come from? And then to kind of go off that, is hustle culture, cancel culture, influencer culture, how dangerous is that within society?
Great, thank you. 3 really good questions. Thanks, everyone. I am going to come first of all to you, Al, on neurodiversity, attention spans. Actually, the bigger question I think you're asking, which is social media changing the way our brains work? And I think that relates to the other question that we had about attention span as well. Do we have much evidence on that, Al?
So, evidence we don't know. So this is a part of what we hope to get out of the upcoming regulation is more evidence that we can, more data that we can use to try and figure out what effect this stuff might be having on us. However, I do want to point to what I think is an incredibly useful concept, which was developed by a sometime friend of mine and one of my favorite living philosophers, a guy called T. Nguyen, who previously works at Utah. I don't know where he is now, but he came up with a concept called value capture. And when I describe to you what it is, I think hopefully it should be obvious why it's so relevant to so much of what happens on social media, but specifically in terms of what you were saying about the way we consume complex information and the way our patience seems to have shortened for it, and also the way people seem to be living their lives vicariously through Instagram. But the idea behind value capture is this: it's a system. A value capturing system is a system which gives you the rewards or the feelings associated with successfully completing or achieving something valuable, but which doesn't require you to go through as much of the work that is usually required to achieve that valuable thing. So in the case of like watching YouTube videos, what have you, I mean, I watch a lot of YouTube, but I watch a lot of YouTube. I don't read as many books as I used to. However, when I've watched a YouTube video on something, I come away from it feeling like, okay, I broadly understand now the subject that this YouTube video was about. The same feeling as I would have come away with having read a book about it previously. Similarly, if you're posting pictures of like the version of your life that you would like other people to think that you lived on Instagram, and you get engagement from that or like kudos from that in a way which gives you a feeling that you might have as if you really lived something that maybe more closely resembled that life than you do, then to one part of your brain there's kind of no real difference. And to me, that concept does an awful lot of work in explaining so many of the ways that social media has changed the way that so many of us do so many things. Because, as we were talking about previously, it's not designed to help us genuinely achieve those kinds of value. It's designed to hold our attention. And one of the best ways to hold our attention is to make us think like believe that we're achieving something of genuine value without making us go through all the effort of actually having to achieve it. So I think the idea of it, once you understand the idea of value capture, you see it everywhere. And I think it does an awful lot of work, as I say, in explaining a lot of these issues around social media.
I think that brings us on very nicely, actually, to the question that I was going to put to you, Africa, which is around the sort of Instagram culture where you're creating a life online that you sort of want to feel is your life. Hustle culture, I think our questioner called it. What do we do about that?
About which part?
About this, about basically us all wanting to sort of living for the online representation of our lives. Is it a problem?
Again, I think it's another very big question. But one of the things that I personally do believe we need to do, I think we need to accept that our digital lives have become very, very important to us. I think we were speaking before we came on stage actually about how so many of us are really grappling with that fact that our digital lives, our social media lives, what have you, have kind of become pretty much second nature. They've just become that thing that we do every single day. It's how we connect with our friends. It's where most of us get our news. It's where we get inspiration. It's where we feel challenged, whether we're aware of these things or not. It's all happening in the same place. I think something that I find is very important for me to do, and I always encourage the people in my life to do the same, is to just always prioritize your offline life more than you do your digital life. And it can sound like a very easy idea, but I think we use social media a lot of the time very mindlessly. If not all of us in the room in some kind of way, wake up, it's one of the first things you do. Throughout the day, you're checking in and checking out. Sometimes you might find yourself just logging back in and you have no idea how the fuck you ended up back in there, but you are. I think there needs to be an element of accepting that this thing is going to be in your life for longer than you might want it to be. So how can you start prioritizing your personal life outside of that? Even if it's the first hour of the day, how can you make sure that you're pouring into your very real life instead of seeing what your favorite influencer is doing, instead of seeing what your favorite thinker has said, instead of checking to see if there's another podcast that's out? How can you start to prioritize yourself? So I think it's one of those seemingly simple things that most of us will disregard, but I don't think things like hustle culture are going anywhere anytime soon, or influencer culture, or cancel culture, which is one of the biggest problems that we're having and talking about in this moment in time.
We haven't even talked about that much today, so
we'll have to come back. But I think
it's a whole other event.
Right. I think there needs to be an acceptance that these things do and will continue to exist, but how can you separate yourself from those things? So I think it's a very internal process. I don't have a specific, practical how-to. I think it's a very personal thing.
And Chris, I wanted to finally come to you on this question about power and the narratives that get spread on social media and who controls that. And I feel like I might know your answer. It's going to come back to the design, and you've very powerfully made that point before. But I guess if you could respond to that question and maybe talk about some of the implications for how we maybe can hold that power accountable or distribute that power.
In relation to like public discourse and so I think one of the problems is that we're taking this sort of logic of making things private, making things direct, making things personal, and we're applying it to public forums. So, if you think about, to just sort of stereotype the idea of literally the town square, right? And if I'm in the town square, or we're all speaking in a room, right? And when I say something, it goes equally to everybody, right? Like so I say words, you hear these words. You also can see each other doing the same thing, which is listening, and you can see us doing the same thing, which is talking. The problem is that this is not how social media works. So if we were to all of a sudden become Facebook, I can become invisible now, right? And like a ghost, I can go throughout this room, and I can start to whisper different things into each of your ears. But also, you're now not in an audience, you're just walking around in your daily life, right? So you're not even aware that you are an audience, right? You're just seeing stuff, and you don't realize that the person next to you is seeing something completely different. And you don't even realize that I'm the one that's trying to make you think something. And so if we're talking about compatibility of this sort of idea of micro-targeting or highly personalized, messaging, or that news feed which is personalized for you. The problem with personalization is that it's not compatible with public discourse. Our democracy requires us to have a common knowledge of what we're doing and who we are and what we're talking about. And you can't really have that with the way social media is currently set up. And so, and I think that really presents a really substantial problem for the validity of a democratic process. Because we have to do democracy together. We can't do it in private.
That's a really good note to start to draw things to a close on. One of the things we want to do to wrap up is we started with a big question. Is social media ruling the world? I'm just going to come to each of you for about 30 seconds each. 30 seconds on that question. So if you can just give us a very top line take. Chris, I'll come to you first.
Sorry, can you repeat the
question? Is social media ruling the world? Is the question we were all here to discuss today.
Yes.
Yes. I love your succinctness. Al, you next.
So, yes, but.
Right.
So, yes, it is. But the thing I think we need to start paying more attention to is that we've been able to get ourselves into a situation where it's ruling the world without us ever having fully got to grips with what we should be using it for. I think the big question for, one of the biggest questions for civic society over the next 10 years is what role does social media play in a well-functioning democracy? I think we're nowhere near even beginning to seriously address that question, and that's the question that we need to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Africa, what about you?
Yes, I would say yes as well. Yes, that's it.
Yeah,
that's all.
Great. Well, all that remains to say is I'm sure you're going to want to join me in thanking Africa, Al and Chris for their insights today. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I've seen some of these people talk before, but I've still learned a lot from the conversation today and taken stuff away. So I really hope that you have too. I'd also like to say a very big thank you to Charlotte. She now has to sign thanks to herself, which I'm sure is a bit awkward. We've got someone signing in the front row, so thank you. And finally, I would like to say a huge thank you to all of you for coming along, spending your Sunday afternoon with us, being such a fantastic and engaged audience and asking such brilliant questions. So thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.